We used to say, "May Africa come back." And in a sense, it's come back in a kind of moral sense, a leadership sense. The people who are calling the shots politically, African, overwhelmingly black Africans. We hear the different languages being used in Parliament, in public debates and so on, but we haven't got Africa back in the sense of direct connection with means of production, with the soil, with the way people live. That has to be done, and it's a very, very valid claim that's being made.
During that long struggle, the first part of that struggle, because from the sound of it you think some of these struggles continue, you spent several months in solitary confinement. Do you think you still bear the scars of that period inside?
I do. You never get over solitary confinement. It leaves a residue, a repository of a deep, deep sadness. And yet, ironically, Sean, I can't explain it. When I was blown up, and I survived, it blew away that misery.
So that was almost a catharsis of what had gone before?
It was like saying, okay, they tried to kill you, and I survived. I survived. You know, people say the definition of an optimist is the glass is half full. I was optimistic. They only blew off my arm. I survived. And that was 1988, and I still feel that today.
And so the period of solitary confinement was what, in the 1960s?
Yes.
1960s. And you spent how long in
Well, it was 168 days
right.
the first time, and then about 3 months the second time, with some sleep deprivation thrown.
And you talk about a terrible moment when you realised that they had actually beaten your body, not physically beaten you, but had kind of put you under such strain and stress that you started to talk. And you didn't talk about people who they could get, you talked about people who had gone or abroad or were past. Did you fear that if that process had continued much longer, you would have been so broken that you would have...
I don't know. It's possible. I got through the first session completely. I didn't say a word, 168 days. The second time it was a much rougher treatment and sleep deprivation. I think something in my food. I collapsed on the ground. They poured water on me. I kept my eyes open. And my choice was try and control my breakdown, because others had withstood it for 3, 4, 5 days, collapsed completely. And then, fortunately, the way these things happen, another person who'd undergone this in another cell, put in an application to court. I heard about it. I smuggled out a tiny little note about my own experience, and the court actually at that stage put a stop to the interrogation. So who knows? I mightn't be sitting here today if it hadn't been for that court application.
You talked then about what comrades who were dead, comrades who were abroad, people that you thought they couldn't get at, to give them something.
At that stage, I was doing that. They were preparing to come back to get me afterwards. I started off by saying I'm making this statement under duress and so on. They just elided it all from the actual document that they had. But afterwards I discovered I'd complained to a magistrate. It's there on, we used to have these flimsies, 5 copies on like pink and green carbon copies, and there it is. For if anybody's interested.
Faint but still preserved for all eternity.
Yes, that I actually complained at the time.
You mentioned a couple of times already the subsequent act, the attempt to murder you by the South African security services. What do you recall of that day?
It shaped me, and it's not only shaped me physically, it shaped my thinking, because when I got a letter, I'm recovering in the London hospital, don't worry, Comrade Albie, we will avenge you. Avenge me? We're going to cut off the arms, we're going to blind in one eye. Is that the country we want? If we get freedom, if we get democracy, if we get justice, that will be my soft vengeance. Roses and lilies will grow out of my arm. And since 1988, soft vengeance has been my theme. And getting the Constitution, helping to write the Constitution, sitting on the court that is upholding the Constitution is all part of my soft vengeance. And soft vengeance is much more powerful than hard vengeance. Hard vengeance is we're stronger, we're doing to them what they did to us. Soft vengeance is the triumph of the ideals.
All the pain you went through, all that period of recovery and convalescence, all, I guess, the fear that at some point that you may not have made it, you didn't feel any anger?
On the contrary, I felt joy that I'd survived, and it's for something. It validates all the pain, the hardship, the misery, the doubts. Yes, we're getting democracy in the country. Yes, we have a court that will stand up to the President, to Parliament, to whoever, if necessary, in terms of the Constitution.
And yet you say that when you took your very young son Oliver
Yes.
to the scene, planning to tell him exactly what had happened to his papa, you couldn't quite bring yourself to tell him the full evil of the system that you had been fighting.
I could tell him about the bomb, the events. Something inside me just blocked me. I didn't want to tell him that his mum and his dad would have been breaking the law just by kissing each other, let alone conceiving him. I didn't want him to hear that from me.
Because his mum was black and you were white.
She's black, or would have been classified
But under
as
the
black.
older
I would have been
apartheid
classified
system.
as
Yeah.
white. I didn't want him to carry that burden from his dad. He'll learn about it in history from others. He's already learning about it.
And for you, that is still the most revolting thing about the system, the inhumanity of that, as much as the violence, as much as the terrible things like, for example, the agents who tried to kill you.
Yes, yes. It's the humanity of the conception that some people are worth more than other people. This is foundational. And it's that denial of basic human dignity. And that's been a huge achievement in South Africa. There's so much that's wrong now. It's not only corruption and unemployment, it's levels of violence. Racism in our society is still very, very strong. But we've got a country. We didn't have a country before South Africa. We've got a constitution, we've got institutions, and we've got people who speak their minds. Samora Machel used to say, leaders come and go, but the people never die. It's a very romantic notion, but I think it's a notion worth holding on to. The people never die.
I wonder if there's a bit of romance that perhaps has got in the way of the transition for South Africa, and that's that perfectly understandable sense of camaraderie, that sense of loyalty to comrades who fought in the struggle for so long, and to the ideal of the African National Congress, to the principle and the belief that you all swore to. Do you think perhaps some people have held on to that too long and perhaps been too willing to put, in a crude way, party before country?
No, the values you can never hold on too long. Never, never, never. And the values always had that critical self-reflection element to it. Oliver Tambo I'm speaking about a lot now. He was so open-minded, so eager to embrace new ideas, new ways of looking at things. But those core values of human dignity, of non-racism, later on non-sex, never changed. That shouldn't change. The loyalty is to the values.
You cannot have failed to see that in a succession of votes of no confidence against President Zuma, for all the allegations against him, the ANC MPs loyally trooped through the lobby supporting the president. And then the first ballot that is held on with the secret ballot, the first motion of no confidence, the most recent, suddenly perhaps 25, maybe as many as 30 ANC MPs vote against him. That's a revelation, isn't it, that actually this is a corrosive thing, this loyalty to party. And only when they're protected by the secret ballot do they vote with their conscience.
It's even more complicated than that, because the story was many more would have voted in favour, except they felt it wasn't for Parliament to change the president of the ANC. The ANC is having a conference in December. The ANC has got to do it itself.
That's fine, but if you're one of those people on the end of all of this, the ordinary people of South Africa, you can say, well, I can have this debate and we can talk about it, but nothing changes. And they hear, for example, all these allegations. The president, the public prosecutor, finds he's $24 million, I think, had been spent on sorting out his property for security. He's told to pay some of it back. He says, I'm not going to pay it back. Nothing changes. Nothing happens.
No. He was ordered to pay some of it back,
Yeah.
and he paid it back. He paid it back.
Only once the court intervened.
Yes, but he did it because people were making a clamour. The court intervened, gave a ruling. His own counsel said, we acknowledge that he has to pay it back. That's not insignificant. In fact, I'd say it's hugely significant.
Would it be better for the country if there was a change of president sooner than the summer of 2019, in your view, as a citizen?
I'm not going to get drawn into that, simply because I don't think it's right as a former judge. The question I would love to offer my views on.
We would love you to do so.
I require, it's a kind of judicial prudence I won't answer.
Are you disappointed with South Africa as it is today? Is it that sense of the curate's egg, good in part?
I think no. I'm much more affirmative than that. It's partly I lived in Mozambique after independence. It was fantastic. We were so excited. We were lifted up by the sense of the revolution, and it crashed. Bitter civil war. It was chaotic.
So are you saying at least South Africa isn't as bad as that?
We haven't had that. It's taken longer, and our institutions are holding. Our elections are meaningful.
So
we had
far.
a higher percentage poll for our municipal elections last year than America had for their president. And there wasn't a single complaint afterwards.
Let me ask you a question that has nothing to do with individuals. Whoever she or he is who takes office after the summer of 2019, what should South Africa's next president aim to do differently from the previous three presidents?
I would hope whoever becomes president of the ANC, who isn't automatically the future president of South Africa, because people have a vote in general elections after that.
They do, but it has been the ANC candidate on every occasion thus far.
Give strong emphasis on restoring integrity of institutions, restoring the values of non-racism, in creating conditions for serious and deep-going economic transformation, but getting the buy-in from as many sources as possible, but with a strong initiative in that regard. And maybe cutting down on some of the bitterness, the sharpness, the toxic elements of our debates, whoever it might be.
Albie Sachs, thank you so much for being with us on Hard Talk. Thank you.
This is the BBC World Service, where the Arts Hour is on tour in Mexico.
After the earthquake, if you took food or water or whatever for those who were in need, they exchanged it for a song.
The funny thing about being a Mexican is that you can laugh at your problems.
I'm Nikki Beatty. We're on stage at the Spanish Cultural Centre CCEMX, and as always, we have live music, live comedy, star guests, a live audience, and we're here as this extraordinary city that's lived through centuries of change begins to get back on its feet after two major earthquakes in September.
And it's our responsibility as artists, journalists, as singers, as filmmakers, as comedians to make our home beautiful again, just as we found it.
The Arts Hour on tour in Mexico at bbcworldservice.com/artshour.
Hello, I'm Anand Jagatia, and after the news I'll be here with Crowd Science, tackling your queries about life, Earth and the universe. This week, listener Diana from New York City has asked, how can we fight unwanted noise? As more of us live in noisy urban cities, the sounds we're exposed to really are affecting our lives, and even our health. So turn your volume to a safe, comfortable level and stay with us for today's Crowd Science, after the news.
BBC News with Eileen McHugh. The Spanish Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy has announced the Madrid government's response to Catalonia's declaration of independence. He has sacked the Catalan separatist leader Carles Puigdemont and his cabinet and dissolved the Catalan parliament. He has also dismissed the Catalan chief of police. Mr Rajoy says there will be snap elections in the autonomous region on December the 21st. Large crowds are on the streets of Barcelona. Major European powers and the United States have said they will not recognise Catalonia's declaration of independence. The election authorities in Kenya say that postponed voting from yesterday's rerun presidential poll, due to take place in 4 volatile western counties on Saturday, will now not go ahead. They said the safety threat to electoral workers was too great and the vote would be held later. The United States economy grew at an annual rate of 3% in the third quarter of this year. Some economists had predicted that devastation caused by recent hurricanes would slow down the economy. Iraq's Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi has ordered a 24-hour suspension of military operations against Kurdish fighters in the north of the country. Mr Abadi's office said the truce was intended to allow a committee to prepare for the peaceful deployment of his forces in all areas of disputed control. The authorities in Bahrain say militants have killed 1 policeman and injured others in a bomb attack. The blast targeted a bus the officers were travelling in near the capital, Manama. And football's world governing body FIFA has refused to intervene in a dispute between the Palestinians and Israel. The Palestinians wanted FIFA to suspend the Israelis because they schedule league fixtures in Jewish settlements in the occupied West Bank. The settlements are regarded as illegal in international law, though Israel disputes this. BBC News.
This cacophony is one of the busiest streets in central Manchester in the UK, where I am currently standing. It's a stereotypical city soundscape at the heart of one of the most highly populated urban areas in Europe. Loads of people, lots of buildings, and a lot of traffic. I'm Anand Jagatia, and hopefully you can just about hear that this is Crowd Science, the show that takes your questions about life, Earth and the universe to researchers hunting for answers all over the world. And as you might have guessed, this week's query is a loud one. We are tackling the issue of unwanted noise. Over to listener Diana in the USA's Big Apple, New York City.
Hi, Crowd Science on the BBC World Service. I'm Diana Nakib, and I'm calling from New York City in the USA. My question for today's program is, how can we fight unwanted noise?
Diana, do you live somewhere particularly loud in New York City? It's famously a loud place.
Ironically, I live in a place that is supposed to be quiet.
Supposed to be.
That is Staten Island. It's a wannabe suburb, and as soon as I woke up this morning, I heard lots of interesting noise.
Can you just paint a picture with words of the kinds of sounds that our listeners might hear if they were there with you?
Oh my goodness. Some of them are helicopters. We're not far from a Coast Guard station, so they often are doing practice flights. And then there are the security helicopters, so helicopters a lot. There are also indescribable sounds, just loud noises, I suppose connected with some kind of construction, but who knows what, it's nothing I could identify. Then there are, our would-be wannabe suburbanites. They work like crazy with all the power tools and all the power lawnmowers and all the power leaf vacuumers. And so the city ordinance says, please do not make noise between 11 p.m. and 8 a.m. And that's it.
The level of these noises, it does sound very noisy. Does it worry you?
I am sort of past worrying. I mean, that's just the background noise, but isn't there some way to block it, to keep it from getting to you or at you?
Well, okay, I think it's up to us really to go and search out a bit of peace and quiet and see whether we can bring any back to you in New York City. So thank you for such a great question. And yeah, we're going to go and have a little nosy around.
Okay.
Time to start our investigation into whether we can stop the kinds of unwanted noises that are driving Diana to despair. But before we do, just an ever so slightly pedantic note. In this case, technically the definition of noise is unwanted sound. So all noise is unwanted. But what counts as noise to you might not count as noise to me. It might just be sound. Anyway, more on that later in the programme. For those of you that live in big cities, it's hard to escape the feeling that noise really is everywhere. So what can be done? A bit of sonic sleuthing has brought us to the bustling city of Manchester. We're heading to an acoustics lab at the University of Salford, where they have state-of-the-art facilities to test the sound-related properties of everything from headphones to building materials. That explains why this place isn't like any lab I've ever been in. It's more like an industrial warehouse, where inside we find ourselves standing on the threshold of what looks like a small, square brick house.
If you want to isolate something from the outside world, which is what the anechoic chamber does, it's a room which is isolated from outside sounds, then you have to build a building within a building.
Yeah.
You'll see we have this sort of metal walkway.
This is Trevor Cox, Professor of Acoustic Engineering, and the reason he's taking me inside this building within a building is because if you want to understand sound, then somewhat paradoxically, the best place to start is somewhere absolutely silent. A room that's completely isolated from all outside noise, known as an anechoic chamber. Shall I shut the door?
Yeah, it's much more impressive with the door shut.
Wow, okay. So this is a very strange looking room. Looks like something out of a science fiction movie. So it's kind of like being inside a hedgehog that's been turned inside out. So all of the spines are facing in towards us from the ceiling and from all of the walls. but they look like giant cheese wedges, giant grey wedges of foam cheese. So we've entered a sort of acoustic dead zone.
When people come in here, that's the first thing they kind of notice is that the voice sounds odd.
Yes, there's no echo. I mean, it's like being in the studios at the BBC, but a bit more impressive.
Yeah, and what happens is people often think that their ears sound a bit blocked, because what you can see is a room, but you can't hear it, because all the reflections are gone, and so you get your senses a bit out of kilter, and that's unpleasant for some people. A small number of people actually ask to leave.
Trevor ain't kidding. It really is a very odd feeling being in a room with no echoes and no background sound. But this kind of space is super useful for acoustic research, testing how well microphones work, or whether ear defenders and headphones do a good job of blocking out noise. Which brings us back to listener Diana, who, when she can hear herself think, has come up with her own ideas for combating the more unpleasant sounds of the city.
Well, it would be great if there was generally available some kind of a bubble that the ordinary person could just put around their entire selves, or maybe just their head, and they could see everything. That's all I have.
Like a big astronaut helmet. Well, yeah,
Yes.
that might be quite an unusual sight to see people walking around New York with these bubbles on, but yeah.
After a while, you'd get used to seeing that.
Back to Trevor. Would it be feasible to walk around with a bubble on your head or something in your ears to block out sounds that you don't want to hear?
There's two ways you can deal with sounds you don't want to hear. First of all is to block it out. That could be earplugs, it could be ear defenders or ear muffs. But then, that doesn't necessarily get rid of it. It's quite hard to get things as quiet that you can't hear it at all, because our ears are really sensitive. They were developed to pick up warning signals like the rustling of leaves out in savannah when, tigers are creeping up on you. And so, as well as trying to get rid of sound, playing some masking sound, some noise that you do want to hear, so it blocks out the background's a good thing as well. But in a noisy city, or say on a subway, on a tube in London, you need to do some attenuation as well, because otherwise the music has to be too loud, and that creates problems of hearing damage. So you can buy sort of headphones which are big bulky ones which block sound out a bit, or you can go to the expensive active control ones if you want as well. But you can also just use what we call passive means, just headphones that block them by physically being in the way.
So Diana's bubble, or perhaps a headphone version of it, is in theory possible. But there's an obvious catch. As Trevor says, our ears are very sensitive to sound because it's useful. Granted, you no longer have to listen out for tigers in the urban jungle, but you do have to listen out for buses, cyclists, security announcements, and fire alarms. And lots of us also have our noses buried in our mobile phones, which means that cutting off the sounds of the outside world completely no longer seems like such a good idea. Are there any other ways that we can try to de-noise our urban environment?
Well, one thing you can do is in the design of each flat or each house, you can make a difference if there's a quiet room. So if your person in New York is trying to sleep and it's too noisy, if they've got a back bedroom which doesn't face onto the big avenue, then you'll actually give them a quiet respite. And there's been research shown in Sweden that if you have a quiet side of your building, then that makes a big difference to how annoying the sound is and what problem it creates.
So it's not always possible to design a building with, the perfect amount of foresight so that it fits perfectly and blends into the sound environment. So are there any ways that we can kind of tweak buildings that already exist to make them better?
Yes, and actually in the lab next door, we actually test building products, bits of partitions, bits of absorbent to see how well they perform. And it's got a very different acoustic to this space.
Yeah, I'm kind of glad. I feel like I need to get out of here, or else I'm going to go crazy.
If you're really lucky, the walls start coming in on you. And
yeah, it does feel like
Indiana
that.
Jones.
Yeah. Help, how do I get out? This next acoustics lab we're heading to sounds completely different to the anechoic chamber. Just have a listen to what happens when you close the door. Very dramatic. So this room, I guess, Trevor, is like the exact opposite of the room we've just come from, and people will be able to hear. There's a lot of echo in here.
Yes, it's funny when you come in here, because the first thing you have to do is talk slower.
Because otherwise your words kind of run into each other.
Yeah, it's so reverberant. It's like being in a very large cathedral. But as you look around you, it's a double height room. It's like a big office. It's not actually that big. But it's called a reverberation chamber because of this kind of echoing effect. And it's used to measure building products. So behind you can see a blue wall, which is a partition. And behind that is another identical room. And what you do is make loads of noise on the other side. And then you measure how much sound comes through that partition. And this is how we check whether constructions will meet building standards, in whether that's British or world building standards.
It kind of reminds me of like the awful acoustics you sometimes get in train stations where the sound's just bouncing around everywhere. I mean, is this the kind of room you could use to help make sound better in those places?
The problem with a railway station is it's too reverberant. There's not enough stuff to absorb the sound, not enough fluffy stuff. So we test absorbance in here. So if you came here at the right time, you would find the seating of, say, the Royal Albert Hall in here, or you might find the studio carpets that have been used in various BBC studios, or you would find bits of absorbent that get used to treat places like railway stations, or everyday spaces like classrooms.
So it is possible to retrofit spaces with fluffy, acoustically absorbent materials to make them sound less echoey. But that can only get you so far, and it's kind of putting the cart before the horse.
Actually, in a lot of environmental noise, the best way of treating noise is to treat it at the source. So if you want to try and reduce the noise in New York City, the first thing is, how do you make the cars quieter? Because if you make the cars quieter, it solves the noise problem everywhere. So you always in noise control start at the source.
You're listening to Crowd Science on the BBC World Service. Today, we're investigating a question from listener Diana in New York City. How can we fight unwanted noise? Now, as someone who loves the hustle and bustle of big cities, I don't want to live in total silence, although I also don't like being kept awake at night by trains or noisy neighbours or fighting alley cats. But the evidence that unwanted sounds in the UK could be damaging people's education and health is worrying. Outside the UK, things may be even worse. Take the city of Mumbai in India. With a population of around 22 million people, it's one of the most crowded places on the planet and could be one of the loudest. By the way, we made a whole programme about population growth, investigating how many people Earth can support. If you missed it, just search for the Crowd Science podcast and scroll back through the episodes. All of our shows are available for free forever. But back to Mumbai, a city where researchers are trying to work out just how noisy it really gets. Mumbai also happens to be the hometown of our reporter, Chavi Sachdev, who carries earplugs with her wherever she goes. And for good reason.
This is the sound of a typical street in central Mumbai. I can't even list everything I'm hearing. Buses, trucks, motorcycles, people, air conditioners, machinery, and of course, the honking. As you can tell, it's loud. But this isn't just a place of work or somewhere that people can leave at the end of the day. I can see homes all around where I'm standing.
Living in this cacophony of noise can be a real challenge. So what noises are the most challenging for people to live with here? I walked up to the houses and tenements along the Western Railway line, where local trains go by all day, every few minutes, and freight trains as well as passenger trains run all night. People live mere feet from the tracks, separated by just a wall and the width of a single-lane road.
I've lived by the train tracks all my life. I'm used to the noise. But if someone new moves here, he won't get sleep for the first few months.
I've lived here for 7 years. I don't even hear it anymore.
I've been here 4 months and I'm becoming so deaf. I can't even hear you.
Then there are festivals. We love a festival in India. There's a major national celebration almost every month. The biggest and loudest of all is Diwali, the festival of light, appropriately celebrated with lamps, lanterns, and fireworks. Here, every family stocks up on what we call firecrackers, and they let them off everywhere. But we know that fireworks are a problem. In the past, they've been loud enough to deafen people, so every year, for the last 17 years, all the firecrackers on the market here in Mumbai have to be tested for noise and chemical pollution before Diwali starts. I've come to the official testing exercise, where officials from the State Pollution Control Board are going to set off and measure the noise from each one to check compliance with the government's noise limits, which are recorded in decibels or dB.
It's a dino bomb.
118.1. The basic aim of this campaigning is to make the awareness among the people, children, about the ill effects of the crackers and also noise effects.
That's Dr. Modghare, a joint director at the Maharashtra Pollution Control Board. He tells me that the government has set limits on how loud the fireworks can be.
The government of India has given the noise standard as 125 dB.
125, that's quite a lot.
It affects your ears. It is dangerous.
For context, the official limit, 125 dB or decibels, is about as loud as a chainsaw or being in the front row of a rock concert. Of course, fireworks are bursts of sound rather than being continuous, but anyone who's been in Mumbai during Diwali can tell you that they do get set off in quick succession for quite some time. So what might this mean for people living here? Well, the World Health Organization warns that regular exposure to loud sounds for prolonged periods can cause permanent hearing loss.
Wow, this one's just going on and on.
Thankfully, the government-run Maharashtra Pollution Control Board, or MPCB, is not relying on their ears to tell if something is too loud. They've got state-of-the-art gadgets to measure the decibel levels. This research is part of a bigger program to identify the noisiest sounds and noisiest areas in Mumbai. The MPCB are currently putting together a noise map of the city area with help from the Awaz Foundation, a non-governmental organization that looks at noise pollution. Dr. Modghare tells me more.
Mumbai is already readings are taken at nearly 200 locations. So it is a very detailed study we have done, and accordingly the recommendation from the scientific body, the city will be mapped.
The Maharashtra Pollution Control Board's new noise map will provide clear zones of acceptable noise, such as no honking zones, silence zones and commercial zones, which they believe it will be possible to implement. Other organizations have attempted to map Mumbai's noise before, but this will be the first government-led official publication. It's due to be released sometime in November. Hopefully, it will have a positive impact and make Mumbai a slightly quieter place to live. But I've been here a long time and I'll believe it when I hear it. In the meantime, I'll continue wearing my earplugs whenever I leave my house.
Chavi Sachdev. I carry earplugs on my keyring too, but luckily for me they're more for gigs and concerts rather than when I'm out and about. Speaking of which, it's time to head back to the streets of Manchester, where two intrepid researchers from the University of Salford are exploring the nature of our urban sounds. We meet them by one of the busiest thoroughfares into the town centre, which is also under a railway bridge. Not the ideal conditions for poor producer Jen trying to record our chat.
Okay, I'm going to have to rethink this because that's not great. Let's do this.
Don't they teach you at radio school, Jen? You're not supposed to do interviews by the side of a road.
Okay, fair enough. Right, try again, Bill.
Hi, I'm Bill Davis and I'm a Professor of Acoustics and Perception at Salford University.
Hi, I'm Max Adams. I'm a lecturer in human geography at Salford University.
So we've just heard about creating noise maps in Mumbai, but here in Manchester we are going to listen to some soundscapes. So can you explain what a soundscape is?
Soundscape basically means a person's perception and response to the acoustic environment.
So it's like a mental sound landscape.
Yes.
Sonic landscape.
Sonic landscape is a very good way of thinking of it.
So we're going to try and explore now a bit of the soundscape of Manchester. How are we going to go about doing that, Meg?
We're going to go and walk around the city centre and identify places that have different soundscapes for you to listen to. We've taken professionals and residents out on sound walks in the past for them to listen to and respond to their auditory environment.
Well, we are in the middle of Manchester, so I don't imagine it's going to get much quieter than this, but, let's go.
Okay, well, we'll walk for about 5 minutes up the road and we'll find a nice, quieter green space for you to listen to.
So, just a couple of minutes walk from where we were, not having to shout anymore. It's so much quieter here.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have turned off Deansgate and, like you say, about 2-3 minutes from where we started, and it's audible.
Yeah, it's a bit less busy.
Yeah.
And the other thing also we can hear is the kind of rustling of leaves in the trees, and we could even hear the flapping of birds' wings, actually. So is that skewing my perception of how quiet it is because of this greenery?
Well, some people would say that seeing green space, access to green space, changes your sensory perception of the auditory environment as well.
Bill, is there also a physical sound wave kind of explanation for trees and greenery breaking up sound waves from busy areas?
A little. It's that you hear the sound of the wind through the leaves, perhaps also the sound of some rain, and people would categorise these as natural sounds. That's right. And every time we ask people to explain their preferences, they almost always prefer natural sounds over other sounds. There is actually a small physical acoustic effect from the trees and the greenery, so they do act a little bit as noise barriers, although they're quite inefficient at doing that, and a 20-metre high brick wall would work a lot better as a sound barrier.
But who wants that? Yeah.
You wouldn't like the way that looks.
It'd be a bit of a horrible park, wouldn't it? It was just surrounded by a big concrete wall. It's just started to rain quite heavily, so let's find some shelter and we can carry on talking. We've just retreated under a tree to try and shelter a bit from the rain. The sound of rain, though, is quite a relaxing one. Again, it's a natural sound. I mean, is the sound of rain something that people tend to report liking in cities?
We quite often find reports of where people are tucked up nice and dry indoors, and the sound of rain is calming. It almost makes you feel cosy. But I think being outside, being caught in it, as we
Probably
were,
not worried about the sound as much, are you?
Yes, you're not really thinking about the sound. But there are cases where water features can have a really positive sound in the city.
Are there any around here that we can go and have a look at?
Yeah, sure. We'll go and see if we can find one.
And just a short walk further, it's stopped raining, and here we are by a really big fountain. It's one of those huge ones with jets firing straight out of the pavement, and if it was a sunnier day, there might be children playing in it. But although the water is all you can really hear, I promise that there are actually hundreds of people, busy roads and trams hooting within a few yards of where I'm standing, which is one of the reasons why you'll often find fountains in cities.
Running water masks speech particularly well, so that as well as quietening down the traffic sound, it can also give us some speech privacy. So it's a kind of all-purpose soundscape element, really. Very useful.
What is it about the sounds of water then, running water, that is so good at masking lots of other different types of sounds?
Running water makes sounds on a very wide range of frequencies, so it's going to cover up the sound frequencies that are present in most other sounds. About the only frequencies it doesn't cover up are the very low frequencies. Large lorry engines and so on we can still sometimes hear underneath the water, but most of the other sounds get covered up pretty well.
I suppose the final thing maybe to say is that I've got my back to the fountain as we're having this discussion and I can't see it. It just sounds like white noise, so I think it doesn't really sound very tranquil to me. So I guess it does throw up an interesting question of the difference between sound and noise, and when does sound become unwanted noise?
Exactly. Our experience of sound is very subjective. If you think about music, for example, we don't all like the same music, and I think if we transpose that into the urban environment, we can perhaps think of similar examples where some people will like it and other people won't.
Right, so sound doesn't really exist just there as a thing in the same way that, air pollution might do. Noise pollution is, it's subjective. It happens inside your head.
Absolutely, and it's the human response to it that we need to know more about in order to be able to do something about it that pleases most people.
Well, I want to ask you a little bit about Diana's original question, so let's go away somewhere and find somewhere a bit quieter.
Okay, let's do that.
So, as we find a less busy place to chat, back to one of listener Diana's original points from the start of this programme. She suggested blocking out unpleasant sounds, but it seems like noise is almost unavoidable in big cities. Is there anything else we can do to improve our urban sonic experience?
We can really do a lot with cities by managing sound right from very early in the design process. They could take on board some of the things that are happening in changes in transport design to make quieter vehicles.
Yeah, and I imagine as the next probably big thing that's going to change the quality of soundscapes is electric cars. So when cars are driverless, so people aren't honking at each other and they're also very quiet and smooth and electric, then it's going to massively change the way that our cities sound.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that will have a dramatic impact on how our cities do sound and the relationship that people then have with their soundscape and the city environment.
And I guess it's also going to have to change the way that we think about designing cities if traffic isn't the kind of predominant sound that exists in them.
Yeah, and as you'll have seen from the sidewalk that we did, there are things that you can do to design a city to incorporate different types of soundscape. So you can move from a very noisy street to a very quiet street very quickly. And I think a little bit of thinking about sound design in the planning stages will go a long way to developing a better soundscape that helps everybody.
So, to Diana and any other urban jungleites wishing that they could turn down the volume on their city, hang in there. With better urban planning and things like electric cars on the horizon, the audio landscape of our environments is shifting. Of course, this change is slow and it isn't happening everywhere yet. But with any luck, the cities of tomorrow should sound a lot nicer than the cities of today.
That's it for this edition of Crowd Science on the BBC World Service. Today's big question was from me, Diana Nakib, in New York City. The program was presented by Anand Jadatia and produced by Jen Winty. If you have a question about life, Earth, or the universe, please email it to crowdscience@bbc.co.uk. Thanks for listening. Bye.
BBC World Service. The news is next. But first, music.
As part of the BBC's 100 Women season, Global Beats brings together some of the best female artists who've appeared on the programme. I'm Rita Ray. Join me for a female spectacular.
Global Beats. Wonderful women at BBC World
militants have killed one policeman and injured others in a bomb attack. The blast targeted a bus the officers were travelling in near the capital, Manama. It's not yet clear exactly who was behind the bombing, but the government blames attacks like this on Shia Muslim militants, who it says are backed by Iran. Tehran denies this. The United States economy grew at an annual rate of 3% in the third quarter of the year, according to new official figures. That was almost the same as the previous 3 months and was stronger than analysts were expecting. Andrew Walker reports.
The US economy has recorded 2 consecutive, quite strong quarters of growth. Its performance in the most recent 3 months was described by one economist as especially encouraging in the light of the disruption caused by recent hurricanes in the south of the country. Consumer spending grew more than many economists expected, and business investment increased strongly. The figures are seen as increasing the chances that the US Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, will increase interest rates again before the end of the year.
Andrew Walker. A senior United Nations official has warned that the independence of justice in Poland is under serious threat. Diego Garcia Sayan, who is a former Peruvian minister, acknowledged that substantial judicial reforms were needed to combat corruption and curb
front of the institutions. Last time that happened was the ban referendum when we saw police violence. So that's what I think many people on both sides are worried about.
That was the BBC's Gavin Lee speaking to me earlier from Barcelona, the capital of Catalonia. Well, Catalonia may have declared its independence from Spain, but will it ever function as an independent state? Major European governments in the United States are all backing Madrid, as is the European Union. Scotland, which has had a failed referendum on independence of its own, is the only nation that has expressed any sympathy. In addition, as we've just heard, the Spanish prosecutor is reported to be pressing charges of rebellion against the Catalan leader, Carles Puigdemont. Let's hear now from Jordi Solé, a member of the European Parliament for one of Catalonia's pro-independence parties. Exactly what does that declaration of independence mean?
Well, it means that there is a new independent state in Europe, the Republic of Catalonia, and it has been born through democracy because the legitimate representatives of the people of Catalonia, by a majority in the parliament, have declared independence. Indeed, we lifted the suspension of to the declaration of independence that was made 2 weeks ago, because back then we were asking, as always, dialogue, negotiation, mediation with Madrid, with the Spanish government, but the answer has been no to dialogue, no chance to negotiations, more repression.